Today's guest is Jay Frey. Jay is a Wheeling native, an amateur historian, and a genealogist whose family history is entwined with the land that now comprises North Park. A retired fundraising professional, Jay serves on a number of boards, including Friends of Wheeling and Wheeling Heritage, and he is the president of the Fort Henry chapter, Sons of the American Revolution. Please welcome Jay Frey.
Thank you all. It's nice to see many familiar faces, the usual history crowd, which I'm part, and it's great to see some new faces as well. So thank you for coming today. So the aim of this program is to shed some light on a long-forgotten piece of Wheeling history. There are a couple of people I'd like to acknowledge who are here. I'm not sure that I've seen Bruce Waterhouse yet. Are you here, Bruce? He may come in yet. But I did want to also acknowledge my friend Gene Finstein, who is my technical assistant today and will be advancing the slides for me. I certainly want to thank Aaron and also Laura Carroll, the new archivist here at the library, for some help they afforded me. And at your tables, and there are a few copies in the back as well, there's a timeline that I think will help you follow the story that's about to unfold. So, moving to our first slide, this is the timeline that there's a hard copy of. Begins in 1773, it ends 200 years later to the year in 1973, and I am going to whiplash you through 200 years in the next 45 minutes or so. I think it's interesting to note that it took 50 years from the time Albert Schenck formed the North Park Land Company until 1969 for the land to actually be developed. More on that in a moment. The next timeline is the Nichols family generational timeline. These are the people who owned the property for the longest period of time, a span of 124 years over 5 generations. And moving on, here is an aerial view of North Park today. And a couple of landmarks here. This is Mount Wood Road. This is Northern Parkway. These are the water tanks that you see driving up. This is obviously North Park. This is the old landfill, which, depending on who you ask, is not being used or being used. And down here is Fulton. This is the National Road and Generation Hub. All right. Today, North Park has approximately 280 dwellings and is home to nearly 750 registered voters. Housing construction began in 1969 by a number of builders, including the Interstate Construction Co, Ryan Homes, and others. Given North Park's proximity to downtown Wheeling, one might wonder why the area was developed so late as 1969. Bruce Waterhouse, and we'll learn a little bit more about Bruce and his connection in a minute, reminded me recently that in the early 1960s there was interest in building a new Ohio County Consolidated High School in what's now North Park. And there are documents here at the library that confirm this proposed project. It was never realized, largely because the expense of putting in electricity, water, and sewage made the cost prohibitively high. And Bruce and I have speculated that that may be the reason North Park was developed so late. This is Mount Wood Road from about 59 Mount Wood Road, leading into North Park, looking east. This is the intersection once you've entered Mount Wood Road to North Park. The first intersection is Raven Avenue, which cuts to the right. This is number 5 Quail Court. If you turn right from Mount Wood Road onto Raven Avenue, the first street that intersects with it is Quail Court, and I'll come back to why that has some significance in the story. And this is looking west from East Cardinal Avenue, and in the foreground are the Northwood Apartments. It's worth noting that from its earliest days, this land that comprises North Park has appealed to people because of the remarkable views. More on that later, too. And here's from the crest of Raven Avenue looking west. So the late Jack Waterhouse is the man who made North Park happen. He was born in Wheeling, April 7th, 1911, lived most of his life here, died on July 20th, 2009, at the age of 98 years. I am proud to say that he was a friend of mine, and I'd like to acknowledge his interest in North Park's history and the help he provided me when I began researching it. As an example, this tome is the abstract of title for the Nichols home farm that Jack Waterhouse gave me. It was drafted by attorney Edmund Lee Jones in 1923, and it chronicles the ownership of the land from 1785 to 1909, and it's been a chief research source for this program. Jack spent most of his life in the field of housing. One of his earliest assignments was manager of the Knickerbocker Village in New York City in the 30s. He pursued an interest in architecture, studying with Francine and Francine, and during World War II, he served as supervisor of war housing in 13 states in the West Coast from 1941 to 45. And from 1947, Jack was a licensed real estate broker. He served as chairman of the Wheeling, Ohio County Planning Commission and as advisor, appraiser, and inspector of the Federal Housing Administration in Pittsburgh. He was a member at the local, state, and national levels of the Home Builders Association, and he served on the board of directors and on the land and development committees of the National Association of Home Builders. He was a member of the West Virginia Land Development and State Building Code committees and served as chairman of the West Virginia Housing Development Fund for 7 years during the terms of Governors Archie Moore and Jay Rockefeller. He was also a member and then vice president of the Wheeling Real Estate Board. His first development project in Wheeling was Grove Terrace, an extension of Louisa Avenue. He developed Crestwood Estates and also Elm Terrace, for which he received the Life Magazine and National Association of Home Builders Award in 1961 for residential subdivision design. When Jack formed the North Park Development Corporation in 1969, he recruited 3 men as incorporators who shared his interests and vision. They were Joseph B. Ducey of Bethany, who had helped found the West Virginia Home Builders Association and who was a director of the National Association of Home Builders. He served in the West Virginia House of Delegates in the mid-60s, and he was owner of the Ducey Real Estate and Building Company. John L. Seabright of Elm Grove also served in the West Virginia House of Delegates. He was associated with the Delta Concrete Company, Seabright Leasing Company, Valley Truck Sales Company, and Seabright Associates. He was president of the National Trail Council of the Boy Scouts of America, served on the board of directors of the Salvation Army Half-Dollar Bank and Our Lady of the Valley School, and he was also a member of President Kennedy's Task Force on Poverty. And last, we have Robert A. Hale of Triadelphia, who was owner of Bel Air Marine Services in Ohio and Construction Materials Incorporated of Morgantown. He had also served as president of Delta Concrete. There's a theme here, and these guys all knew each other. And he was director of the former Farmers and Merchants Bank of Bel Air and on the executive board of directors for Progressive Bank of Wheeling. Jack's children, on the right side of the slide, were the officers of the corporation. John, his son, was president, his son Bruce was vice president and treasurer, and his daughter Mary Beth Chiazza was secretary. Are any of the Waterhouse tribe here? Apparently not. This is interesting. This is a plat of North Park from 1967. So this is pre-construction. This is the inset that is the image that I showed you from the aerial photograph of North Park. Here's Mountwood Road, Quail Court, Raven Avenue. It's just marking out where the construction is going to happen. Okay, so let's turn back to the origins of North Park. It did indeed begin as a land grant, and this is a map of West Virginia land grants and surveys assembled by Aubrey Lane and John Lopen. It's hanging on the wall upstairs in the hallway. In 1773, the Commonwealth of Virginia granted 400 acres to Thomas Worthington. Now, the year 1773 is very early in Wheeling history. It's only 4 years after Ebenezer Zane settled here, and it precedes Dunmore's War and the Revolution. An immigrant from County Cork, Ireland, Worthington relocated from Kentucky to settle in Wheeling. And I should take an aside here to tell you, this is not the Thomas Worthington who lived from 1773 to 1827 and who was one of Ohio's first 2 senators and later Ohio's 6th governor. Different person. As you can see on the map, the Worthington grant ran from the Ohio River eastward, adjoining the land grant to Jonathan Zane. Here's the river, Jonathan Zane, John Culloch, and Richard Yates. And up a little bit off the screen, 2 other land grants, one to Jesse Hollingsworth and Jacob Rieger to the north. Other than his presence here, I'm not able to find anything about Worthington's life in Wheeling. He was only for 5 years. He died in 1778. We know that his wife, Anne Clark, predeceased him. They were the parents of 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. Upon his death, Worthington's land passed to 2 of these daughters, and I'm going to quote his will. "Unto my daughters, Catherine and Marianne, I do bequeath and make over my plantation near Wheeling to their use, only I desiring that it may be sold at public venue, the money lodged with my son-in-law, Jacob Rieger." Presumably, Rieger was husband to the 3rd daughter, Elizabeth. Daughter Marianne was the wife of James Graham. Graham was a Scottish immigrant. He served in the Revolution in the Northwest Campaign under General George Rogers Clark. He was also at the Battle of Blue Licks in Kentucky, and he went to the Falls of Ohio, which is present-day Louisville, Kentucky, with General Clark. The other daughter, Catherine, was married to Samuel Hawkins in 1782. He was born in 1762 in Botetourt County, Virginia, and died in Eaton, Preble County, Ohio, in 1814. Hawkins was also a Revolutionary War veteran, and he also served in the Ohio militia during the War of 1812, rising to the rank of colonel. So, Mr. Worthington passes away in 1778, and 7 years later, the Worthington daughters prepared to sell their father's plantation according to his wishes. The tract was resurveyed on June 8, 1785, and was reduced from the original 400 acres to 328 acres. 72 acres was lopped off the north portion because it was realized that it was part of Jesse Hollingsworth's original grant. Now, the Worthington land was purchased in 1785 by John Nichols, my 5th great-grandfather, and Patty's 5th great-grandfather. And with this purchase began the Nichols family's 124 years of ownership. John Nichols settled in the Wheeling area sometime before 1775 when he was sworn in at the court at Fort Dunmore, later Fort Pitt, as a constable for West Augusta District, which was renamed Ohio County in 1776. In 1777, he sold a portion of his farm called Walnut Valley in Frederick County, now Washington County, Maryland. And in 1785, he sold the remaining portion of that farm. So with the sale of his Maryland property, he was positioned to purchase the 328-acre Worthington tract from the 2 daughters, which, as I said, he did in 1785, or so he thought. Catherine Worthington's husband, Mr. Hawkins, represented himself as acting on behalf of both daughters. But for whatever reason, Mary Ann Worthington and her husband, James Graham, were not willing to participate in the sale. Hence, Nichols did not have a clear deed. 6 years later, in 1791, Hawkins of Bourbon County, Kentucky, provided Nichols with a bond in the amount of, quote, $200 lawful Virginia money, $200 in lawful Virginia money, to pledge that he would provide a deed for the land. In this book, I have that document, if you can believe it, signed by him in 1791. Now, Mr. Hawkins appears to have forfeited his $200 of lawful Virginia money because he failed to produce a clear deed. And when John Nichols died in 1803, the issue had not been resolved. Nevertheless, he bequeathed to his widow the use of the plantation, which I now own, except for 100 acres, which my son Amos now occupies. And the bequest continues that the 300 acres is to be divided among his 3 youngest sons, Edward, Amos, and Matthias. All right. The absence of a deed was resolved in 1805 by a partition agreement by the Ohio County Commissioners, who were Archibald Wood and John McCulloch. And they divided the property between the Grahams and widow Nichols and her son Amos. And the shaded area here at the top is what the Nichols got, and this is what the Grahams got. Over a period of this makes it a little clearer, 132 acres, the green and purple areas is what the Nichols got, and this is what the Grahams got. Okay. In 1809, the Grahams sold this piece of property to a fellow named George D. Knox, and I'm going to digress here to tell you a little bit about Mr. Knox because he's kind of interesting. He and his business partner, Reddick McKee, purchased Wheeling's first glassworks in 1821 from its founder, George Carruthers. Knox was a Scotsman, born in 1761, and interestingly, he served in Captain Van Swearingen's company here in Ohio County during the Revolution. He was among the first directors of the Wheeling Exchange Bank, and he served as Wheeling's mayor in 1815-16. He relocated to Howard County, Missouri, where he died in 1833. Okay, back to the Nichols. Over the period of about 3 years, from 1814 to 17, the three sons, Amos, Edward, and Matthias, sold their interests in the land partition, and they all relocated to Zanesville. Only Edward retained his one-third ownership of the riverfront property here because he was operating a ferry boat across the river from 1810, and he kept it. All right. The will says my three younger sons, so were there older sons? Indeed, there were. And John Nichols Jr. was one of them, our fourth great-grandfather. He was about 40 years old when his father and namesake died in 1803. He'd been a widower himself since 1790 when his wife Nancy Neely died. Their only surviving child was Hugh Nichols, my third great-grandfather, who was born in Pennsylvania in 1788. So after his wife's death, John Jr. remarried Ruth Van Meter Hanna. They resided on land on Wheeling Creek that she inherited from her first husband, who was granted it in 1784. In 1820, they sold the property and moved to Zanesville to be near the other brothers. And here's Hugh Nichols. In the family, he's known as Old Huey, or the Old Gentleman. And there's so much to tell about him. He was, as they say, a force of nature. And he really deserves his own Lunch with Books program. And I'm going to tell you probably more than you ever wanted to know about. With his mother's death and his father's remarriage, Hugh Nichols was raised by his maternal grandparents, Hugh and Florina Neely. And obviously, Hugh Nichols was named for his grandfather. By 1776, the Neelys were residing in Mount Pleasant Township on a 318-acre farm in Westmoreland County. At some point after the Revolution, the Neelys relocated to Wheeling, where Hugh Neely died in 1805. His widow, Florina, died in 1817. Their grandson, Hugh, was 29 years old, and he was a primary beneficiary of his grandmother's will. 1817 was a big year for Hugh. He married Rosanna Kotz that year on November 27th here in Wheeling. She was a daughter of Conrad Kotz and his wife Elizabeth. Mr. Kotz came from Pittsburgh to Wheeling in 1810 and opened West Virginia's first commercial coal mine, located near present-day 5th Street, providing fuel for blacksmithing and domestic use. All right, as a young man, Hugh Nichols was a successful merchant, originally operating a grocery. With money his grandmother Neely had provided him during her lifetime, he invested in land, which provided him with rental income. Now, with his inheritance from his grandmother and his own income, Hugh set about purchasing the land that had comprised John Nichols' original plantation. And here are the dates and the purchases. So, here in 1820, he purchases from his uncle Edward the riverfront property. In 1828, he purchases 2 tracts. This is and 65 acres. There's another piece of land in there that wasn't from the original land grant. In 1829, he purchases this piece of land. Let me give you the narrative on that. He purchased it from the county. Zachariah Jacob, for whom Jacob Street is named, was the county commissioner. And the land had been purchased from Mr. Knox by the Ohio County Overseers of the Poor. It was going to be a poor farm. And in all, Hugh Nichols purchased 230 acres, which includes this, and this. He and John Ritchie School, Glassworks in South Wheeling, swapped some land, and Hugh got this 23 acres. And then many years later, this 14 1/4 acres was purchased in 1870 by the Nichols Trust. About the ferry business, that might be the thing for which Hugh Nichols may be best remembered. He bought the riverfront property and ferry, as I said, and he conducted the ferry business after he bought it from his uncle, but he expanded it in 1844 when he bought the ferry landing at Jefferson Street in Martins Ferry, Ohio from Ebenezer Martin. Along with the landing, he bought Mr. Martin's steam-powered ferry boat. It was built in 1841 by John Pringle of Brownsville, Pennsylvania. It was the first steamboat in the area, and he renamed the boat City of Wheeling, and he operated the ferry business until 1862. His involvement grew in various other business enterprises. He was a subscription commissioner of the Union Line of Steamboats, an investor in the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, and in the Hempfield Railroad Company. And in 1855, Hugh, Abijah Johnston, and James M. Todd formed a company under Todd's name as the second firm to operate the Todd Mill, which was Wheeling's first ironworks. But the foundation of his success financially was rent income that he derived from extensive real estate holdings in Wheeling and in Ohio and Marshall Counties, Belmont County, Ohio as well. His property acquisitions run for pages and pages in the Ohio County deed books. In 1836, he bought another farm from Solomon Burgham's estate, 117 acres on Peters Run, to which he added in 1856 another 206 acres he purchased from Isaac Kelly. And the Burgham property remains in the possession of his descendants today, and I am very happy to tell you that those descendants are with us. Ed Nichols, his sister Judy, and his wife Marge. Cousins, great to have you here. The other notable land acquisition was in 1857. Hugh purchased from William and Margaret Gregg the 375-acre Gregg Farm on Woods Run. And its Greggsville is named for William and Margaret Gregg. That property today is known as Washington Farms. And, you will be surprised, I was, Washington Farms is contiguous with North Park. So in the top left, that's the house that was at Washington Farms, the only house that was at Washington Farms in the late 1800s. That's my Uncle Charlie and my Aunt Dee Dee in the garden about 1905 at Washington Farms. That's our grandmother. Do you love the clothes? That's why I threw it in. I mean, she's styling. She's in the front yard of Washington Farms. This is the house that stood in 1982 and I think was torn down, actually. I don't think anything happened to it, but a very large and pretty house is there now. Note this little piece. That's that piece. That's the only part of the original dwelling that remains. It's made of stone, and it was the kitchen. All right. There's a lot more to say about Hugh, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, sort of gloss over that. I will tell you this. He was very interested in agriculture. There's an article in the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, May 1st, 1858, carried an announcement of the appointment of commissioners by act of incorporation of the Virginia Northwestern Agricultural Society, and Hugh Nichols was one of the commissioners. We know he raised merino sheep, and it's said that he introduced that breed to Ohio County. He loved horse racing. There is a recollection of him in Windberger's History of Wheeling and Vicinity. It describes he always presided at the races, and you could hear his call, "Already? Go!" as far as you could hear a steam whistle. And last little bit, the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, February 11, 1860, carried a notice to the public, appealing to them to attend a meeting at the Ohio County Courthouse for the purpose of choosing delegates to the convention at the city of Richmond to, quote, take counsel together upon our duty as citizens of Virginia and the Union. And clearly it was a strong unionist. Okay. All right. This is the house that stood at North Park. Hugh Nichols built this finely proportioned red brick mansion in classical revival style on the highest elevation of the home farm. According to family tradition, Cottage Hill Mansion was built about 1812. Now back to my earlier reference about Quail Court. Jack Waterhouse told me that the Nichols Mansion stood near present-day Quail Court, and he added that the site is no longer the highest point of elevation due to land contouring that was done during the construction of the housing up there. And he added that when the site was being excavated, this is his quote, "We ran into a lot of old homemade red brick." So there you go. Hugh and Rosanna Nichols resided there until their deaths on April 12, 1863 and August 6, 1863, respectively. Upon their deaths, the home farm passed in trust to their grandchildren. I'm going to quote Hugh's will. "I will and devise my home farm and the Gregg farm, Washington Farms, to Isaac Cotts as trustee for the use and benefit in trust with the children of my son Washington. I wish and charge that my son Washington and his wife be supported by the said children of said Washington." The trustee, Isaac Cotts, was Hugh's brother-in-law, and Cotts' wife, Susan McCord, was Hugh's first cousin. Here's another view. You come in the farm road, so let's imagine you're going out Mount Wood Road, and you're coming up to the approach to North Park. The road would be over here. The house sits sort of on the side, and this is looking out over Fulton. Note here, there's a big drop-off. It's a little hard to see, but it's a very steep drop right here. That's what we're talking about, contouring the land. They flattened it out. They took the highest prominence and pushed it into the valley so that it made more even elevation. Hugh Nichols developed this home farm into a much admired property. The 1879 history of the Panhandle includes this description. George Washington Nichols, residing on a hill overlooking Fulton, has the privilege of owning as valuable a farm as any in the Panhandle, admirably appointed, abundantly stocked, and conducted under the highest state of cultivation, with a home thereon of ease and beauty. It was inherited from his worthy father, that would be Hugh, a zealous pioneer, and so early as 1818 a successful merchant in the present city of Wheeling. I love this. This is a hand-drawn map of the grounds around the mansion. And you can see, I think this might have been for a scavenger hunt. It says begin here. What's that all? And it's got a figure. So here's the house. There's a spring house, a smokehouse, privy, the garden, a barn, a buggy shed, and lots of pasture and orchard land. Okay, this is George Washington Nichols, the said Washington. He was Hugh and Rosanna's only child. He was born March 6, 1818. In 1841, he married Elizabeth Meek Robinson, a daughter of James Robinson and Sarah Wells of York County. And there she is. The Nichols had 12 children, 11 of whom survived to adulthood. This is Washington and Bessie with their infant sons, William Ammon on the left and Isaac Henry Nichols on the right in 1856. Here's another photo I really am very fond of. This is Rachel Rosanna Nichols her sister Sarah Elizabeth, and her brother John Wells Nichols. How many of you know Susan Hogan? Okay. How many of you know Bob McCulloch? Okay. How many of you know me? I'm getting to something. That is Bob McCulloch's great-grandmother. That is Susan Hogan's great-grandmother. That's my great-grandfather. They were siblings, so we're third cousins. So it's like they said, in Wheeling, don't say anything about anybody. All right, here's all 11 of them. In birth order, from left to right. Hugh Robinson, John Wells, James Decatur, Rachel Rosanna, Joseph Washington, Sarah Elizabeth, William Ammon, Isaac Henry, Nancy Jane. She's standing by the window of the mansion up on Ella died in 1964 at the age of 97 years. Is that amazing? And Aunt Emtel. Now there's a story there. That's a strange name. They kind of ran out of names. She's the youngest. If you visit the Washington graves up at Washington Farms, one of them is Emtel Washington. So they took the name and named Aunt Emtel. Okay. This is another photograph of the 6 of the same group. These were the siblings who were single at the time. And I think this was in the 1870s, roughly. Okay, this is the view from the mansion portico. And from that vantage, it offered a spectacular view of the Ohio River, south to Benwood and beyond, across to the island, Bridgeport, Bel Air, and Martins Ferry, and of Fulton, Wheeling Creek, and the National Road. If you're up at the highest point in Mount Wood Cemetery, you kind of get a feel for it. But remember, the house was on an even higher elevation, so it must have been quite a view. We have a first-hand account from a letter George W. Lippincott wrote to his cousin, Ella, the one who died in '64, and it's dated December 27, 1945. The scenes from the front portico were wonderful, up and down the great Ohio River, the horseshoe bend around Wheeling Creek, and the Pike Highway, McCulloch's Cliff, where he made his famous leap. The view was gorgeous. One could sit with a spyglass or opera glasses for chances to see the trains going through the tunnel underneath the Pike Highway, the steamboats plying up and down the Ohio River, and my, how Uncle Wash knew them all by their whistles. And the mills over in Martins Ferry, the bridge over the Ohio River. And then you could pick out places of interest in Bridgeport, Bel Air, and the island, and on down to Benwood towards Moundsville. And it was always cool and restful away from the humdrum of Wheeling. The air was invigorating. Now, you remember that little girl in the middle of the 3 siblings? Okay, here she is all grown up. And if you can see, right there, 1913 is what that says. Here's another interesting story about the view from the mansion that implicates, we call her Aunt Sack. I don't know why, but we did. This is from Blanche Neff's column called Kindred Kernels in the Wheeling News Register, December 19, 1937. It was a 85th birthday tribute to Sarah Nichols Emlyn. Mrs. Emlyn was born December 19, 1852 on what is now known as the Washington Farms. Parenthetically, Dr. Ed Phillips and family now occupy this site. She lived on the farm until she was 10 years of age. The family then moved to what is now Mount Wood Road. Her grandfather, that would be Hugh, who was an only child, owned all that territory, miles and miles of it. The old homestead is still known as Nichols Place. It was from this site on the hill that Mrs. Emlyn, then 9 years old, saw John Hunt Morgan and his men while on their famous history-making raid. They got as far as Martins Ferry Hill and were blocked and driven back. Mrs. Emlyn, with some of her playmates, stood on the West Virginia Hill, and the incident is decidedly clear in her mind. All right, here is Cottage Hill Mansion. In the window Matthias Nichols. This little boy is Albert Emblem. Anybody remember him? Albert Emblem. This little boy is Rob Emblem. That is Susan Cox's grandfather, or Susan Hogan's grandfather. That's Sarah Elizabeth, the little girl who saw Morgan's Raiders. That's Betsy. That's James Emblem, Sarah's husband. That's, who is that? Ella. And that's Washington Nichols with a fishing pole and his horse. More on that in just a second. Okay, I'm back to George Lippincot's letter. Best of all was Uncle Wash and Aunt Betsy and their flock of boys and the girls and their beaux, and besides all the grandchildren. And the big events, many of them, marriages, feasts, parties, the big dining room and long table with gravy for breakfast, always. The girls assigned duties and the boys theirs. Uncle Wash and Aunt Betsy always kept the upper hand in keeping each one to their particular task picked out for them to do. We youngsters were interested mostly in the big water wheel that carried the wire and rope down to the good spring to bring the water up to the level of the kitchen door. And then there was the big baking oven outside. Well, the big event for me was when Uncle Wash took me fishing up the Ohio and rode out into the water to fish. Old lady, that was a horse, who's actually in the picture, knew just how far to go into the water. And we got some fish all right. Then the other event was when you made up, this is Ella, made up your grocery list from the stockroom pantry to go to Johnny Welty's store. That was a trip in the wagon. And I remember the cherry trees and the pies, too. And I figured somebody would ask me, do you have any interior views of the house? And I had to search high and low, but I do have a couple of interior views. This is Betsy and Washington in the parlor up at Cottage Hill Mansion. These are, let's see if I got this right. This is Nancy Jane, Rachel Rosanna, and Emma. It was a two-parlor house, so they're in the other parlor. That's probably about 1905. Okay, Washington Nichols passed away in 1901 at the age of 83. 3 years later, his widow Elizabeth Betsy died, also aged 83. In 1909, 3 of the 6 surviving heirs and their spouses, this would be James Decatur Nichols and his wife Mary Catherine Marshall, Rose Nichols Lippincott, and Ella Nichols Emblem, and her husband Joseph Emblem. They sold their undivided right title and interest in the home farm to Albert Schenck, containing 375 acres, more or less. And this western portion, except for the riverfront property, is now North Park. This is Albert M. Schenck. He was a son of Friedrich Schenck, a German immigrant and the founder of the successful meatpacking company. He formed the North Park Land Company in 1917 and transferred the acreage he purchased to this entity with plans to subdivide and develop the property. A sales prospectus by the People's Land and Investment Company was published in 1920, describing Nichols' addition to Wheeling, featuring a planned park and zoo, and extolling the views and offering, this is so strange to me, a free deed upon death. Well, how good does that do you? Okay. This is from the prospectus. So, this is where the planned zoo and park were to be. This is the farm road out to the Nichols farm. That is the mansion. So you can see the elevation. They were kidding. It was very high. And that's Fulton. Right? And this is the map. If you turn your head sideways, you can read that. It says Nichols addition to Wheeling. Looks, kind of like the other one we looked at from North Park. Here's the river, Wheeling Creek, and this planned subdivision that never happened. So these plans were not realized. Mr. Schenck died in 1930. His son, Albert F. Schenck, inherited ownership and presidency of the North Park Land Company. In 1938, he filed a certificate to, quote, cease and discontinue business, end quote. And he deeded the land held by the company to Carl G. Bachman in 1939. Bachman Realty sold the property to the Interstate Construction Company in 1967, setting the stage for the development of North Park. And with that, we've come full circle. This is a little note about Mr. Bachman. He was a Wheeling native, born in 1890, son of Charles F. and Sophia Bachman. Graduated in 1908 from Lindsley Institute. He attended Washington and Jefferson College for 2 years and graduated at West Virginia University with a bachelor's degree and a degree in law. He began the practice of law in Wheeling in 1915, and in 1917 was appointed assistant prosecuting attorney of Ohio County, and he served as congressman from the 1st District of West Virginia in the 1920s. He died in 1980. When Mr. Bachman was working on the idea of maybe someone would buy his land for the consolidated school, this is the map he was using. And it was deemed by the surveyors to be accurate. And it's right up here, if you want to see that in the presentation. All right, this is an image of the Cottage Hill mansion after the family has decamped. So there's nobody living there. And I have a little epilogue about the house. And this is from the Wheeling News Register, September 15, 1924. Banner headline: Nichols Homestead famous landmark is razed by fire. The old Nichols Homestead on the Mount Wood Road, which for a century and a quarter has stood as an historic landmark on a point high above the city, was completely destroyed by fire yesterday afternoon. The flames towered high above the hill, and a pall of smoke standing out above the homestead appeared as a black shroud for the old place. Lack of a water supply in the vicinity of the burning structure caused firemen to make no attempt to drive their engines over the road to the house, although Fire Chief E.A. McGranahan with associates drove to the fire. The condition of the road precluded bringing other of the department's vehicles there. The fire had a great start by the time the alarm had been telephoned to fire headquarters. When firemen were able to reach the burning building, the flames had attained such headway that it was evident that the property was doomed, it was said. Another minor headline: hundreds watched the flames. The building and its wings burned for hours until late in the afternoon. Its destruction was watched by hundreds from points of vantage on Wheeling Hill in the valley, and flames and smoke were visible for miles. Many also made their way to the scene of the fire over Mount Wood Road. The homestead in which many had lived has been without tenants for the past several years, the sole survivors of the pioneer family making their homes elsewhere in the city. It was said yesterday that boys had been seen playing about the property, and their presence is connected with the blaze. Carelessness with fire in their play is blamed for the burning of the building, although this theory was advanced only as a surmise by the officers. And that's the building after the fire. I have a very long list here of people I would like to thank. And many of them are no longer with us. But in particular, Audra Wayne is the one who really straightened me out when I was trying to look at the old land grant maps. Where are the Nichols? They're not here. Where are they? I know they were here in that period. Well, she's the one who said, that's the Worthington grant. I think that might be your clue. And were it not for that revelation, I would be doing the program. So thank you for your attention. I hope that you learned something you didn't know before. I don't think this is a well-known story at all. I appreciate your kind attention, and I'd be happy if I can answer any questions.
Question.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that Nichols Farm went down to the river.
It did.
Well, obviously Route 2 going north there, and that's a real steep hill. And then there's a railroad in there.
Right.
What happened to that part of the land?
It was never farmed. It was just property that they owned. And when the county put Route 2 through there, they got a right-of-way from the Nichols. Wheeling Iron and Steel Corporation, what we now know as Wheeling Steel or Wheeling Pittsburgh Steel, had its plant there. And it was because it was near a source of coal. And I should say there was a lot of mining going on that land, up at North Park and down by the river, a lot of mining going on. If you see a topographical map of that area, it's like a honeycomb. It was really pretty much mined out of coal. So, again, they never farmed it. Hugh operated a ferry from that riverfront property, and it was industrial property, but they owned it. They got so sick and tired of being given a nominal amount for a right-of-way, for a railroad, or a telegraph line, or a telephone line, that they finally plotted it out. If you see Riverview, maps for Old Riverview, which is right along the river, right pretty much where the Northern Parkway enters Route 2, that's Riverview. The Nichols family subdivided it as if they were going to build on it so that they could get a better price for it if another right-of-way went through. Nothing was ever built on it, but the maps are in the city engineer's office. It's a good question. Thank you. Any other? Yes, Peg?
I'm not clear on how is your descendants? I lost you somewhere. How do you go back to the Nichols?
You'll be very sorry you asked, because I know this very well. John Nichols, who came here from Maryland, is my fifth great grandfather. He had a son named John Jr. who did not figure in his will. He didn't inherit any of the land up at Mount Wood. His son was Hugh, my third great grandfather. Hugh's son, Washington Nichols, is my second great grandfather. John Wells Nichols, the guy with the whiskers who's in the picture, is my great grandfather. And his daughter, Grace Nichols Waddell, was my grandmother. Yes?
Could you give us a general idea of where in North Park today, where was the mansion?
Quail Court.
Where?
Quail Court.
Well,
Yeah, all of the streets up at North Park are named for birds.
yeah.
And if you drive Mount Wood Road, the first intersection you come to is Raven Avenue on the right. And if you take another right, that's Quail Court. And there was a photo I showed earlier on. You think you can pull that up or not? And that's what Jack Waterhouse told me when they did the contouring of the land. They ran into a lot of old homemade red brick. That was where the house was. Thank you. That's it there. So if today you would drive up to North Park on Mount Wood Road, you turn right on Raven, just look to your right, you're going to see that house. That's where the home was.
So past what the big apartment buildings?
Yes, yes, you go not far past them. The Northwood Apartments, those are called, yes. But you can't tell because, again, it was the highest elevation. I remember taking my grandmother, the Nichols grandmother, up to Mount Wood Cemetery. We have a lot of family buried there, as you might guess. And I said, where was the farm? And this was pre-construction. She said on the highest elevation was where the farm was, the house. Yeah. John.
The Wells in the genealogy, how was she related to the Wells sisters after whom Wellsburg was named?
They were cousins. He's talking about Betsy, Washington's wife, was the daughter of James Robinson and Sarah Wells. Sarah Wells was the daughter of Nicholas Wells, whose father was Benjamin Wells. And Benjamin Wells had a son who had been Nicholas's brother, Charles Wells, who was the founder and namesake of Wellsburg. And what John's talking about, Charles went down into Wood County, is it? And carved out a big piece of property there and developed it. And his daughters inherited the property and really developed the town. And I think their names were Sarah and Delilah. I know one of them was Delilah. And they named it Sistersville because they were sisters. That's what the Wells family is very interested. You know the story about the Great Wells family and the Little Wells family? Well, the Great Wells family were all over 6 feet tall and big. And the saying would go, and they were very distantly related, and they were the Little Wells family, who were tiny. And people used to say, here come the big Wells, there go the Little Wells. You couldn't make it up, really. Yes?
How is Mountainwood Cemetery then related to all this property?
It was a cemetery from 1848, so that's well within Hugh Nichols' lifetime. He died in 1863. It was part of Robert Wood's land, and it was purchased to be a cemetery. And you opened the door for me to address one of my pet peeves. You go up to Mountainwood Cemetery, you don't have to go far in the road in the cemetery, and you see a tomb in the hillside. It's the first one on the right. And there are tablets that say, Isaac Cott's, 1863. It's not Isaac Cott's tomb. It's Hugh Nichols' tomb. Isaac Cott's built the tomb on Hugh Nichols' instructions. Hugh Nichols died in 1863. Isaac Cott's didn't die until 1879. So here's the dark side. The tomb was vandalized in 1935. And the bones therein were strewn everywhere. And they were reinterred in the ground outside. And the markers are there. The Hugh Nichols' grave is there. But I was told it was very uncertain who was buried where. And, really, it was in Grant's tomb. So I would certainly venture to say that there were probably plaques there that said Hugh and Rosanna Nichols and their dates, that when the tomb was vandalized, disappeared because they sealed it up with a cement block, and their graves are outside the tomb. But yeah, that is not Isaac Cott's tomb. Other questions? Thank you so much for asking that. If you have time and the inclination, I have some documents up here that you might be interested in. One is from Samuel Hawkins, 1791. I also have a real estate bill for Hugh Nichols from 1857. It's kind of amazing. And this map.
Lunch with books. Lunch with books has cooks and cooks and hacks and cracks and yells and sings and rocks and swings with more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yoga. Hey, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pop. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.